We catch up in Acts with Peter and John, and the leaders of the Jewish people are rather cross. We only get an inkling in our reading today of just what it was that made them so angry. Perhaps you think it was some criminal misdemeanor, perhaps some breaking of the Jewish law. It is in fact neither of those, simply the healing of a lame man. They don't even heal him on the Sabbath, which is, of course, what got Jesus in trouble in the Gospels. It's just the fact that they're healing him at all. And you may wonder, what is it about this particular event that causes them to be arrested? What's so astonishing about this miracle? After all, many healings had occurred at Jesus' hands and the hands of his followers. And in fact, people had even been raised from the dead. Surely that is more impressive and more of a reason for incarceration. The answer, friends, for what is so astonishing about this miracle is provided to us in the final verse of the reading. Not only was the man lame, but he was of exceedingly old age. The scriptures state, "All men glorified God for that which was done, for the man was above 40 years old." All things indeed are possible for God. But more seriously, I want to share with you a story which illustrates perhaps what it was about this healing that caused John and Peter to find themselves locked up for doing it. It, I think, wonderfully exposes the thought process of those leaders who opposed them. It's a story that I borrow from Dr. Scott Alexander. He's a psychiatrist practicing in the US Midwest, and he calls this story the Hairdryer Incident. This was the biggest dispute he'd ever seen in his time in practice as a psychiatrist in a mental health hospital. Most of the time, the psychiatrists got on fairly well with one another, agreeing about the matters that were most important. But every now and then, they found themselves in conflict, and none more than over the hairdryer incident. The backstory is this. A woman came in suffering with obsessive-compulsive disorder. She'd drive to work every morning, and she'd worry that she'd left her hairdryer on at home. So she'd arrive at work, turn around immediately, drive home, and check. It wasn't on. She'd come back to work. She'd start her day, and then she'd think, well, perhaps I didn't check carefully enough. She'd turn around, she'd go home and check once again. And this was happening 10, 15, 20 times a day. Now, she was working as a high-powered lawyer. Well, trying to work as a high-powered lawyer, and this was destroying her life. She was chronically late to all the meetings that she was meant to be at, and her practice was spiralling down and down, and she thought that she would have to quit, to give up her career. She wasn't able to go out with her friends. She'd arrive at the restaurant, order her food, and then think, have I left the hairdryer on? Jump in her car and go back, and by the time she returned, her order was cold and her friends disgruntled. She'd seen countless psychiatrists, psychologists and counsellors. She'd done all sorts of therapy. She'd taken every medication in the book, and none of them had helped. So she ended up at the hospital of Scott Alexander. She came and she saw a colleague of his who said to her, "Have you thought about bringing the hairdryer with you?" And it worked. She'd be driving to work in the morning. She'd start worrying about whether she'd left the hairdryer on. She'd look across at the other seat in her car, and there it would be. And she only owned one hairdryer. It was accounted for, and she could get on with the rest of her day. She'd be out with her friends. She'd think, have I left the hairdryer on? She'd check in her bag. There was the hairdryer. She only owned one. It was accounted for. And she'd get on with her meal. And approximately half the psychiatrists at Scott Alexander's hospital thought that this was absolutely scandalous. And like the Jewish leaders, they would have arrested the psychiatrist had they had the opportunity. This, after all, is not how one treats obsessive-compulsive disorder. This is outside of the rules and the regulations. What if this got out into the broader psychiatric community? That instead of giving high-tech medications and sophisticated therapies, we were just telling people to put their hairdryers in their bags and take them with them in their cars. The other half thought that the psychiatrist deserved a medal. Here was somebody who was absolutely untreatable by the normal methods, with a debilitating condition and a drop-dead simple intervention that nobody else had thought of gave her her life back. Several years later, Scott Alexander opened up his own psychiatric practice, using a picture of a hairdryer as the logo. The point of this diversion, apart from it being a story that I like and that being the prerogative of the preacher, the point of this diversion is that sometimes we can be so distracted by the process that we fail to celebrate the outcome. That's what we heard in the story from Acts today. The Jewish leaders are cross, not because any particular rule has been broken, but because they feel threatened. When they hear the news of this man's healing, their initial reaction should be a joy and thanksgiving to God. But instead we hear them ask, by what power or by what name have ye done this? These are servants of Yahweh, the one and true God. They shouldn't think there's any other name by which these people could have done this. This is the God who commanded, there are to be no gods before me, I am one. They should have known that all things good and holy come from God. Yet because John and Peter are not members of the establishment, because they're not operating under the direction of the leaders and the authorities within the hierarchy, they are doubted and they are disdained. The leaders have slipped into a foolish way of thinking. They've confused the power of position with the power of God. And therefore they reject the power of God operating in the apostles because they lack position and rank. For those of us upon whom the world bestows position and rank, it's all too easy to follow the same path. Have you confused the position of power with the power of God? Have you rejected the power of God operating in those who lack position and rank? The interesting thing about this tale, I think, is where we might see ourselves in it. For many Christians around the world and throughout Christian history, they would have most easily identified with John and Peter, standing in opposition to those who wield power and authority, proclaiming Christ from the grip of shackles. For most of us, though, I suspect, whilst we may face antagonism from time to time, for the most part, we're more like the leaders. We're the ones who are in charge and define the status quo. It's we who are bothered when upstarts arrive acting outside of our structures and our carefully formulated plans. Perhaps the lesson for us from this narrative is not keep going even when you face persecution, but instead maintain some humility. We're to remember our fallibility, our mortality, our smallness next to God, no matter how much our society has blown up our own importance. And to remember that, despite the availability of high-ranking religious leaders, despite the availability of learned scholars, God chose to use Peter, a cowardly fisherman, and John, barely more than a child. And as far as I know, he has no plans on tightening up his selection criteria. Amen.